Hi, and welcome to Module 3 of this pluralsight course named Practical HTML5. My name is Gilles Kleren. You can follow me on Twitter via @GilesKleren. In the first two modules of this course, we have created the skeleton for our site. We have created some base pages already. We have also styled the pages somewhat with some basic CSS, and we've thrown some very simple JavaScript into the mix. In this third module, we are going to extend the site. That's quite logical. We're going to make some changes to the navigation of the site, as well as allow the user to place an order for coffee using a form. In this module, we'll spend some time creating that form, which uses all the new additions added to HTML5, which make it easy to manipulate user input. Let's start by taking a look at the agenda for this module. As mentioned, we'll add some navigation to the site. For this, we'll use the nav element to indicate to the browser what is making up the navigation of our site. Secondly, we are going to create a form for the checkout procedure for our site. HTML5 comes with a lot of new input types, and we'll use these to create a better experience than what was possible with HTML before. In the third part, we'll look at some other new options we have in HTML5 to validate user input, again with the purpose of making sure that the user gets the best experience while working with our site. When we will have reached the end of this module, we'll have created a menu inside a nav block, clearly indicating what makes up the navigation for our site. We'll also have created the checkout page, on which we will use the new input elements that come with HTML5 out of the box. And not only are we going to use the new input elements, the page will use the new validation options which come bundled with HTML5. So by the end of the module, we'll have another functional page added to our site. Every site needs navigation, and our Joe's Coffee Store site isn't an exception to this rule. In the previous modules, I have intentionally not added any navigation to the site's pages yet, so we'll do that now. Before we add navigation to the site, let's see what HTML5 is adding in this area. Typically, a site has its navigation at the top of the page. Most commonly, it's a series of links pointing to other pages. In HTML4, so before the days of HTML5, we would normally wrap the links to all other pages inside of a div. Inside that div, the actual elements would then be list item elements, li elements, so children of a UL, an unordered list. Using CSS, we can then apply styling to make these into real buttons to navigate to the actual pages of our site. The surrounding div would normally be attributed with a class or an ID so that we can apply a style onto it. Typically, this style or ID would then be named something like nav or navigation. And you can see that here in the slide. Now with HTML5, things haven't changed that much. However, we now have a new element, the nav element. And inside the nav element, we'll use the UL again with the li items. The nav element mostly has a semantic meaning again. It's used to indicate to the browser and to search engines that its contents is the actual navigation of the page. The nav element isn't adding any visual behavior. It's not creating a typical menu for our page automatically. For that, we still have to use CSS like before. Also interesting to note is that the nav element defines no extra attributes, so there's not a lot of customization we can do on it. Most of the time, the nav element is used for navigation on the page. Sometimes it's also used for navigation within a document. This could be, for example, for a table of contents for a long document or page. Let's go back to our site and let's now add navigation to the pages we have created in the first two modules of this course. When we look at the current state of our page, there's one very important thing missing, and that is navigation. It's currently impossible to navigate to other pages. So let's add navigation. As explained in the slides, typically we'll add navigation by means of an UL element, so an unordered list with a couple of LI elements. Of course, you can use other solutions, but I'm going to go with this solution for now. I'm going to put this UL inside of the header. At this point, it's basically unclear that this UL is going to be the navigation of our site. I'm going to change that by surrounding it with the new HTML5 nav element. As explained in the slides, this nav element doesn't make its contents into a menu. We still have to use CSS for this. I have a class prepared called background gradient. So what this nav now did was actually making clear that its contents is the navigation for our site. Let's take a look at the result. In the resulting page, we now see our navigation sitting here at the top of the page. It contains a couple of links which are inside of a solid brown background color. We'll change that later into a gradient, hence the name of the CSS class. Let's go back to the slides. Now that we have navigation in our site, we can also navigate to the checkout page soon. But on a checkout page, the user has to enter a lot of data, such as his address, his birthday, his email, and much more. We've had the ability to post data in HTML for a long time through the form element. Inside the form element, we could then add input elements which allow the user to enter data and later send that data to the server. In previous versions of HTML, we were quite limited in the amount of input types we had, and therefore often had to resort to external libraries such as jQuery to guide the user while he was entering data. In this part, we'll see how HTML5 changed this, and we'll soon start the creation of the checkout page in the next demo. When entering data in a web form, it's important that we guide the user while entering data. Making sure that the data is right from the first time takes away a lot of frustration. If the data is valid, the user won't be presented with errors, indicating that he made an error. He won't have to wait while the page is sending the data all over again. So as the developers of the page, we should try to guide the user in entering valid data. Now, what is valid data? On the client, we don't know all the business rules, so we can't check everything, that's for sure. But there are quite a lot of things we can already check. Is a date entered by the user in the correct format, or at least a format we can use later on the server side? Or for example, is an entered email address really an email address? Again, previously, we had to use third-party libraries to do these validations. The third block is validation on the form itself. For example, has the user entered data in all the required fields? While all of these features were possible before, they weren't possible with just HTML. We had to use some external library to make the forms more user-friendly and more interactive. With HTML5, all of these requirements are covered out of the box. For example, HTML5 introduces many new input types which can make sure that the data entered by the user is of the correct type. Let's start by taking a look at these new input types. So as said, HTML5 has a lot of new input types. They are indeed input types, so to add them to a page, we are still using input and then add the type. It is for this type parameter that a lot of new options have been added to HTML5. Note that not all of these new input types add validation though. Some are there just to make the input of data easier by, for example, only allowing the user to pick a value. On this slide here, you can see a list of new HTML5 input types. We now have color, date, email, number, range, search, tel for telephone number, and URL for website addresses. In the next couple of slides, we'll take a look at some of these in a bit more detail. Dates are probably the de facto standard where users of a site enter all kinds of, let's say, incorrect data. The major problem with dates is of course that the date can be entered in many formats, and depending on the region of the user, often has a different input format as well. Previously, when a user had to enter a date in our site, we'd call for the help of, for example, jQuery. The new input type equals date brings out of the box support for a date picker in HTML5. Here on the site, we can see an input type date inside of a form. It's rendered by the browser natively, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. So that means that it looks different depending on the used browser. Input type email allows us as developers to create an input where the user can enter a string, and the input can validate automatically if the entered data is indeed a valid email address. Again, this would normally require us to use JavaScript. However, this new input type email is included in the HTML5 framework, and it's therefore easier to use this one straight away. When the entered data is invalid, so in other words, not a valid email address, then the browser will indicate this. This is what you see in the screenshot. Again, the way that this is handled is dependent on the browser. Another new input type is URL. The name really gives away for what this new input can be used, I think. Indeed, it can be used to validate that the entered data is indeed a valid URL. When this is not the case, again, the browser will indicate this. On this slide here, you can see how Internet Explorer and Chrome are handling this visually then. A neat new input type is color. Probably this isn't one you'll need that often, but when you do, you'll be happy it's included in the HTML5 framework. What this input type does, it will open a color picker from the system and allow the user to select a color. The selected color is then shown and can then be sent to the server when the form is posted. The last two ones we'll talk about before the demo have to do with numeric input. The first one is, well, numeric input, so an input which only accepts numbers. There are a lot of places where this comes in handy, such as a quantity field or a credit card number. In the sample code here, you can see that the input type has been set to number. At the bottom, we can see how Internet Explorer and Chrome render this input. Chrome renders up and down buttons to increase or decrease the value of the entered input. IE doesn't do this and therefore has no specific rendering for this type. The second one related to numeric input is the range type. When the user can enter again a numeric value, but the value has to be between a minimum and a maximum, then we can use the range input. In the sample code, we can see that the min and max attributes have been set to 1 and 10 respectively. This means that the final value can only be between 1 and 10. This input type is rendered using a slider element, as you can see in the screenshots on the slide. Again, there's a slight difference between how browsers are rendering this element. Now that we have seen the new input types, we are going to create the checkout page in the demo. For the creation of this page, we'll use, of course, these new input types.